Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world of grim silence, dull blades, and bone-deep routine. Imagine you're standing on damp timber scaffold, the weight of your axe matched only by the weight of what it means to swing it. The crowd murmurs, the condemned trembles, and you're the one they pretend not to see. You are the executioner. There's no glamour here, no cheers for your precision, no thank you notes from the crown, just steady pay, bad smells, and worse isolation. And even if you do your job perfectly, you're still the person everyone avoids at the market. Also, let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive this job, not just because of the physical demands, but because the mental toll, the social exile, and the daily brushes with blood and death would grind most people down by year 2. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin in the Holy Roman Empire, around the early 14th century. You're not yet an executioner, not officially. Right now you're just a poor craftsman, maybe a butcher, or a tanner, someone already used to cutting things open and being avoided in public. You're sturdy, quiet, and most importantly, willing to take a job no one else wants. Because here's the catch. Executioner wasn't a title you were born into. It wasn't an honor. It was more like a civic necessity that stuck to whoever was most expendable. Often, towns would appoint the role to someone already dishonored, sometimes even to a criminal, on the condition they could carry out their first execution without flinching. That's a tough job interview. Once chosen, your life changes overnight. You're no longer part of regular society. People avert their eyes when you walk through town. Children whisper. Your neighbors stop inviting you to market stalls. But at the same time, ironically, you become essential. The city literally can't run without you. You are now the Nachrichter, a German term meaning night judge, though it's really just a polite way of saying you deal with death. Your job isn't just swinging the sword or axe. You also flog petty criminals, brand thieves, boil counterfeiters in oil if the sentence demands it. You escort prisoners, you dispose of bodies. Sometimes you even torture confessions from suspects, legally of course. And despite being hated, you're not poorly paid. Executioners often made more money than craftsmen. In Augsburg, one executioner made 5 times the income of a master shoemaker. The job came with housing, tax exemptions, and a surprising amount of municipal power. But all that didn't change your social status. You're still an outcast, untouchable in a very literal sense. Your house might be on the edge of town, near the gallows or outside the city walls. The neighbors are other social exiles, lepers, gravediggers, prostitutes. You form your own little fringe community. Some executioners even marry the daughters of other executioners, keeping the stigma neatly contained. And you can't just stop being an executioner. If you leave the job, the taint follows you. People remember your face, your hands, your smell. You'll be denied entry to guilds, markets, even churches. You are, in effect, branded without iron. The tools of your trade are expensive and personalized. Executioner swords, for example, were broad, dull-tipped, and usually engraved. Oddly beautiful. You don't use a guillotine, that comes centuries later. No, your tools are older, cruder. An axe for publische, executions, a rope for hangings, maybe even a wheel or cart for breaking bones. Beheading sounds clean, but it wasn't. You had to be strong, precise, and utterly unflinching. It could take more than one strike. Anne Boleyn had a skilled French swordsman. Lucky her. Most people weren't so fortunate. A poorly trained executioner could miss. The axe could get stuck in bone. The crowd might boo. Or worse, riot. A bad execution turned the mood fast. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before the swing, there's routine. You might start your day visiting the jail, checking on the condemned. Not out of kindness, though some executioners were known for surprising tenderness, but to ensure the prisoner would be ready. Sometimes a drink was given. The executioner's cup, they called it. Strong wine or schnapps, enough to dull fear, but not too much to impede walking. Then you escort them to the scaffold. The town gathers. The mayor might read the sentence. You, dressed in black, hood optional, step up. You nod to the crowd, or not. Sometimes there's silence, sometimes jeers. And then it's down to business. A final prayer, a blindfold if requested, and the swing. If you do your job well, the body drops clean. You hold the head high. The crowd murmurs approval. You've done your civic duty. And tomorrow, you'll clean the blood from your tools yourself, because no one else will touch them. But there's more to your role than death. Executioners were often asked to be healers. Yes, really. Folk believed their hands, having dealt in blood, had curative power. In some parts of Germany, children with hernias were passed through the legs of an executioner for luck. You might also extract teeth, lance boils, or deliver herbal cures. It's a strange duality. The one who ends life also preserves it. And yet, the respect is shallow. You'll still eat separately, walk separately, die separately. Punishments varied wildly. Boiling, flaying, breaking on the wheel, all part of your toolkit. But for every dramatic execution, there were weeks of nothing. Waiting, maintaining gallows, checking ropes, preparing the site. Your job was more about readiness than action. You were the quiet machinery of justice, barely acknowledged but always present. What happens if you refuse a job? Well, you can't. The sentence is law, and you're its hand. Refusal could mean your own punishment, or dismissal. And once dismissed, where would you go? Your children, if you had any, would face a heavy choice: inherit the trade or inherit the shame. Some did both. Others tried to escape it. But records show executioner families stretching generations, bound by duty and social exile. We like to think of executioners as brutal men with black hoods. But the truth is duller, sadder. Many were lonely, thoughtful, trapped, just men doing what others could not. One French executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, oversaw nearly 3,000 executions during the French Revolution, including Louis XVI. His journals reveal guilt, fatigue, and surprising tenderness. He saw himself not as a killer, but a servant of law. His job was ugly, yes, but necessary. In towns where no executioner was available, sentences were delayed, or worse, carried out by amateurs. Those ended badly. Bones broken out of order. Heads half-hacked. The public hated a messy death. Ironically, they respected efficiency, even if they spat at you in the street. Still, every now and then, people showed quiet gratitude. A clean execution was considered a mercy, a whisper of thanks, a look of relief. Small things, easily missed. And what of your tools? You cleaned them yourself, sharpened your own blades, stored them in wooden trunks, oiled against rust. Some were buried with you, others passed down. Tools of trade like a blacksmith's hammer, just heavier. You kept records too, names, dates, crimes. Some executioners had beautiful handwriting. Their logs survive today in dusty archives, testaments to ordinary men with extraordinary burdens. But how did it feel to end lives so often? Did they dream of the condemned? Did their hands shake in private? One wonders. Most never wrote about their feelings. Maybe they weren't allowed to. But here's the question I want you to sit with tonight. What does it mean to be necessary but unwanted. The executioner was essential, yet never embraced. A man called upon, but never invited in. And that, more than anything, may be why it truly sucked to be a medieval executioner. So you've been appointed executioner. You've survived the first few jobs. Shaky at first maybe, but you're improving. You've learned how to read the weight of a crowd, how to time your movements, how to avoid flinching when the blood sprays or when a prisoner weeps for mercy. This is now your life, procedural, exacting, and deeply misunderstood. Let's go deeper now, into the mechanics of what you do. Your daily reality revolves not just around death itself, but around how that death is delivered. You're not just following orders, you're observing custom, law, and the strange ceremonial choreography of public punishment. Every method of execution has a set of rituals attached to it, often hundreds of years old, and they must be followed to the letter. Take beheading, for instance. It's considered noble, reserved for aristocrats, traitors, and those deemed worthy of a clean, honorable death. But even this high-status punishment could go wrong, horribly so. An unskilled headsman could take multiple strokes, reducing a moment of closure into a prolonged scene of panic. There's the infamous case of Mary, Queen of Scots. Her executioner took 3 strikes. The first 2 didn't sever the head. The third finally did. Then, when he lifted the head, her wig came off, and her actual head, white-haired and withered, tumbled to the floor. The crowd gasped. Not exactly the quiet dignity her rank was supposed to assure. Compare that to hanging, the go-to punishment for thieves, deserters, and peasants. Done wrong, it could mean a long, choking death. The key to a clean hanging wasn't the noose, it was the drop. You had to calculate the correct length based on the person's weight and height. Too short, and they strangle slowly. Too long, and the head pops off. Both outcomes are bad for business. You'd be surprised how mathematical it all became. Executioners in later centuries had to dereference tables, essentially physics-based charts to ensure a proper neck break. But in the early days, it was trial and error, a sickening kind of experience-based learning. Then there's breaking on the wheel, possibly one of the most feared punishments in medieval Europe. It wasn't meant to kill quickly. Quite the opposite. The victim was strapped to a wagon wheel, limbs outstretched, and you, the executioner, would systematically crush their bones with an iron bar. First the legs, then the arms, sometimes the chest. If the sentence was merciful, you'd deliver a final blow to the heart. If not, the victim was left on the wheel to die over hours or days, exposed to the elements and birds. But you didn't get to choose mercy. You followed what was written, and if you didn't, if you showed too much compassion, you risked punishment yourself. One executioner in 16th century Saxony tried to shorten a condemned man's suffering with a quick death against orders. The authorities fined him and threatened his job. Mercy, it turns out, was not always legal. Then we have burning, used for heretics, witches, and occasionally counterfeiters. Contrary to popular belief, the fire wasn't always started right beneath the person. In some regions, straw was piled around them and lit from a distance to create smoke and panic first. Sometimes the person was strangled before the fire reached them. But again, only if the sentence allowed it. Executioners had to know all of this. Every region had different laws, customs, expectations. In one town, decapitation might be considered merciful. In another, it could be forbidden altogether. You were not just a killer, you were a legal technician. And the audience? Oh, they mattered. Public executions were civic theatre. They reinforced law and order, reminded the public of consequences, and in a strange way, entertained. Some people brought snack, ash. Vendors sold drinks. Children climbed on shoulders to get a better view. Your role was central to the drama. You weren't just administering justice, you were performing it. In larger cities, the scaffold might be built in a town square, raised and decorated with the city's crest. It wasn't unusual for you to wear special clothing, black robes perhaps, or a leather apron. And while the image of the hooded executioner persists, that was relatively rare. Most didn't hide their faces. Everyone already knew who you were. The tension in the air before a sentence was always the same: buzzing anticipation, half-hidden dread, and the silent hope that someone else would have to carry the burden. You also had a hand in corporal punishments, floggings, amputations, ear cropping. These too were performed publicly. You needed skill to whip someone hard enough to satisfy the sentence, but not so hard they died. Same with branding. A hot iron placed too shallow left no mark. Too deep caused infection, and infection meant death, which was not always part of the plan. Let's not forget torture, legal in many parts of Europe for centuries. You weren't the one passing judgment, but you were the one turning the screw. The rack, the strappado, the thumbscrews, you administered them all under legal supervision. It was your job to follow the protocols, to ensure the body bent but didn't break, unless that was required. Despite all of this, some executioners kept personal codes. They refused to torture women or children or deliver more than one blow. There were stories, hard to prove but persistent, of executioners whispering apologies as they worked, of offering small kindnesses before the end. A sip of wine, a soft word. One executioner in Nuremberg was known to pray over each person before lifting the sword. Another kept a small ledger in which he recorded not just names and crimes, but also final words. It's a curious thing. Even men trained to deliver pain sometimes tried to preserve a fragment of dignity, for themselves and for the condemned. Yet for all this ritual, all this precision, you were still feared and loathed. You couldn't walk freely in church. Your touch was thought to carry spiritual impurity. In some places, priests refused to give you communion unless no one else was present. People wouldn't drink from the same cup as you, wouldn't sell you bread, wouldn't let their daughters speak to your sons. It was this dual existence, necessary and reviled, that slowly hollowed you out. There's a record from 17th century France of an executioner who lived just outside the town gate. Every Sunday, he stood alone at the back of Mass. People parted when he entered. No one greeted him. But if there was a sentence to carry out, they called for him immediately. He never refused. He kept his boots polished and his blade sharp. He was always ready. And when he died, they buried him in unconsecrated ground, just outside the cemetery wall. His house was abandoned. Eventually, the town forgot his name. Only the records remained, his handwriting crisp and meticulous, his task complete. But even in the darkest corners of this profession, there were moments of strange redemption. Some executioners were respected in their old age. If they served the town loyally, without scandal or failure, the stigma faded a little. Children brought them apples. Bakers left them bread at the edge of the stall. There were even rare cases of towns petitioning to give an old executioner a decent burial within the city walls. And then there's the odd case of Franz Schmidt, perhaps the most famous executioner in German history. He worked in Nuremberg in the late 1500s. Over a 45-year career, he executed 394 people and administered thousands of lesser punishments. But he also kept a detailed journal, clinical, precise, and deeply human. Franz wanted more than anything to have his family name cleared. He believed he had served with honor. And near the end of his life, he appealed to the Holy Roman Emperor to lift the hereditary stigma on his children. Remarkably, the emperor agreed. Franz died a free man. His children could become guild members, merchants, even clergy. But most weren't so lucky. By now, you're probably wondering, did executioners ever question the system they served? The evidence is thin. Most left no writings. But those who did seem to understand the contradictions. They didn't see themselves as villains, nor as heroes. They saw themselves as servants of law. And like any servant, they followed orders, even when those orders turned their stomachs. But maybe, just maybe, Some wondered what it would be like to live another life, to shake hands without hesitation, to buy bread without whispers, to sit in church among others. Not apart from them, the wheel still turns, the sword still gleams, and somewhere, in a crumbling archive, the handwriting of a forgotten headsman still tells the stories no one wanted to speak aloud. Next time, we'll explore what happened after the swing, how the dead were disposed of, how communities remembered the condemned, and how executioners themselves tried to find meaning in the aftermath of death. But for now, let this question echo quietly as you drift. What happens when your entire identity is built around endings? The moment after a life ends is oddly quiet. The crowd begins to disperse. The murmurs die down. The blood cools on the stone, sticky in the midday sun. And you, the executioner, are left with the body, the blade, and the silence. This is where the real work begins. Because executions don't end with death. They end with disposal, with documentation, with the slow, unglamorous work of making sure the system forgets the person properly. And in this strange final act, you remain the guardian of order. In many towns, the disposal of the body was as choreographed as the execution itself. If the sentence included public display, say gibbeting, you would have to prepare the corpse. That often meant boiling it to prevent rot, coating it in pitch or tar to keep the birds off, and hanging it in an iron cage somewhere visible, above a city gate or beside a road leading into town. For hours or days, you might watch travelers walk beneath a swinging cage, casting up nervous glances. The message was never subtle. Don't end up like this. But what if the sentence didn't call for display? Sometimes you were permitted to bury the condemned. Not in a churchyard, of course. That was consecrated ground. These people died outside the grace of the church, and therefore outside its walls. Instead, you brought them to the executioner's field, a stretch of land usually outside town, often near the gallows itself. These places, grim, neglected, were rarely marked. Few gravestones, few names. Sometimes just a mound of dirt and a scrap of cloth to mark the shape beneath. You dug the grave yourself, or had a helper do it. Maybe you muttered a prayer. Maybe not. You'd seen too many bodies by then. You couldn't afford to carry each one. But that's not entirely true, is it? Some stories suggest executioners did remember the dead, quietly, privately, not with sentimentality but with a sense of weight. Records exist of names kept in private ledgers, of condemned people whose last words stayed with the headsman for decades. Franz Schmidt, in his long-running journal, even described the regrets of the dying, their fear, their trembling prayers. He didn't embellish. He didn't mock. He simply recorded. It's a strange kind of humanity, tucked into the footnotes of horror. Sometimes you were asked to handle bodies from mass executions, rebellions, insurrections, or purges. These were brutal jobs. The corpses piled high. There was no dignity, no ritual, just haste and exhaustion. One such case occurred after the Peasants' War in 1525. In the wake of the failed uprising, thousands were executed. In towns like Würzburg, Rothenburg, and Fulda, executioners were tasked with beheading or hanging sometimes dozens in a single day. The toll on the body and the mind was considerable. And yet, they did it. Because someone always had to. After the bodies were gone, after the crowds had moved on, there was still the matter of the tools. Your sword or axe had to be cleaned and resharpened, the scaffold scrubbed, the ropes reknotted. In some towns, this work had to be completed by dawn the next day. No trace of death could linger too long. Some executioners kept small shrines in their homes, not religious ones necessarily, but quiet places where they stored the records of their work, a wrapped bundle of court orders, a page with names, a lock of hair perhaps, a piece of a broken chain. These were not trophies. They were burdens, reminders. You might wonder what the people thought of you, really, beyond the sneers and whispers. Were you feared, pitied, secretly admired? It depended on the day. In towns where justice was swift and order prevailed, you were seen as an extension of divine judgment. But if you botched a beheading or allowed a criminal to escape, the mood turned quickly. There's a record from 1541 in which an executioner in Basel failed to decapitate a nobleman cleanly. The crowd rioted. Stones were thrown. The town council fined him and nearly had him flogged in public. You see, there was very little room for error. Your own health could become a point of concern. An injured or aging executioner was a liability. Some were quietly retired, given a small pension and allowed to vanish. Others were replaced unceremoniously, even after decades of service. And when you finally died, the ceremony, if any, was brief. Many executioners were buried in the same unmarked fields as their former charges, but not all. In some places, the profession passed from father to son, a grim inheritance. Sons of executioners had few career paths. Most guilds wouldn't accept them. Most churches wouldn't bless them. And so, the role repeated, quietly, reluctantly. The tools passed down, as if coated in lead. A few rare families managed to escape this cycle, by marrying into distant towns, by changing their names, by hiding their lineage. But for most, the stains stuck. You weren't just the executioner. You were of executioners, and so were your children. Still, history has a way of softening the edges. Over time, people forget the fear and remember the necessity. Executioners began appearing in civic records, not just as killers, but as keepers of public health. In fact, they were often assigned other unpleasant tasks, disposing of plague bodies, cleaning waste from the streets, inspecting brothels, or managing stray dogs. These jobs weren't glamorous, but they were critical. You became, in effect, a municipal problem solver. If something needed to be cleaned, cut, buried, or removed, it was likely your job. And slowly, this gave you a strange kind of status. In 18th century France, for example, the Sanson family ran the executioner's office in Paris for over 150 years. Charles-Henri Sanson executed Louis XVI during the French Revolution. He was a complex figure, stoic, methodical, and reportedly racked with guilt over the king's death. His memoirs, though heavily edited after his death, suggest a man torn between duty and conscience. But he was also respected, consulted. His opinion carried weight in civic matters. Some historians argue that executioners were the first bureaucrats of death, not just enforcers of punishment, but agents of the state, trusted with managing the most delicate aspect of governance, the end of life. They filed reports, tracked statistics, balanced the emotional weight of justice with the cold mechanics of law. And yet, despite all of this, what remained was the paradox. You were needed, but never embraced. One might ask, did any executioner ever lay down the sword, walk away? Few managed it. The financial and social barriers were immense, but some did. A few were pardoned from service and given other roles, land stewards, jailers, or guards. Others fled, assumed new identities, and left no trace. But for most, the role was lifelong. Even in retirement, people crossed the street when they saw you. Even if you never executed another soul, the ghosts stayed with you. In the quietest moments, in the space between sleep and waking, you might remember the face of a young girl accused of theft, or the merchant who wept as the noose tightened, or the rebel who spat at you and shouted defiance even as you lifted your axe. You might wonder if their final words were true. You might wish you could forget them, but you won't. Because your profession carved itself into your bones, into your hands, into the way people looked at you, into the way you looked at yourself. And history, with its dry documents and brittle pages, remembers you not with warmth, but with precision. You are a line item in an archive, a signature beside a death, a footnote in someone else's fall. Still, some of us are curious. Some of us read the ledgers, the journals, the execution rolls, and we try to imagine you, not as a villain or a monster or even a judge, but as a person who carried out the state's will day after day, year after year, until the silence came for you too. Perhaps your greatest punishment wasn't the work, but the loneliness. You were always at the center of the spectacle, and yet always apart from it. You bore witness to hundreds of endings, but you had no one to bear witness to you. And so, as we leave the scaffold behind and the crowd disperses for good, we offer you this, the simple act of memory, the acknowledgement that you existed and that your burden was not yours alone. You were part of history's machinery, quiet, precise, forgotten, and now remembered. Now that our first story has ended, we'll begin our next quiet chapter, a new tale from a different corner of forgotten history. So take a breath, sink a little deeper into rest, and prepare to travel gently into the next story. Story 2, Salt, Sand, and Survival. The caravan cities of the Sahara. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the stillness of the Sahara, not the sharp, cinematic version of sweeping dunes, but the kind that stretches endlessly in every direction, where silence itself seems like a weight. There's no birdsong, no rustling leaves, just wind, sand, and heat rising in waves so strong it distorts the air. And yet, in this desolation, people moved. Caravans hundreds strong. Men, camels, salt blocks, and sacks of gold dust plodding in quiet rhythm across thousands of miles. It was boring. It was slow. And it was one of the most essential systems of commerce and survival the medieval world ever knew. You might be picturing a romantic oasis, or perhaps the iconic city of Timbuktu. But before we get there, let's start with the actual engine of it all, the trade routes themselves. Specifically, the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, which stretched across West Africa and linked the rich kingdoms of the Sahel to the Mediterranean world. Here's what you need to understand. This wasn't just a road across the desert. There were no roads, no signs, and certainly no pit stops. These were shifting paths carved by generations of nomads and traders who learned to read the desert like a map, by the stars, the dunes, and the taste of the wind. The routes shifted depending on raiders, politics, and water. And yet, some towns grew, like stubborn roots in an impossible landscape. Towns like Sijil Masa, on the northern fringe near Morocco, or Ouderkust at the edge of the Sahel, but none rose higher or glowed brighter than Timbuktu. Let's pause there. Yes, Timbuktu is real. And no, it's not just a punchline for somewhere far away. It was a very real, very dusty town in present-day Mali that once housed some of the greatest libraries of the medieval world. But before it became a center of Islamites, sea scholarship, it was a way station, a dusty half-circle of tents and mud brick, where camel caravans arrived like slow-moving ships on an ocean of sand. But let's rewind, because before there was gold, or learning, or scholars, there was salt. The Sahara was full of it, thick slabs of mineral-rich salt buried beneath the sand in places like Tagaza and Taudeni. Men would dig them out, working in searing heat, often blindfolded or wrapped in cloth to keep the salt dust from blinding them. They would cut the slabs into standard shapes, about 30 or 40 kilograms each, and load them onto camels. Then they walked, for weeks, maybe months. Why? Because salt wasn't just a seasoning. In tropical West Africa, where salt was scarce and essential for survival, it was currency. People needed it to preserve food, to survive the heat, and to maintain health. Entire economies were built on it. So salt went south, and gold came north. You might think of gold in terms of coins or bars, but in the Sahelian empires, it often came as dust. Fine, bright particles panned from rivers or dug from shallow mines. People stored it in hollowed-out gourds, leather pouches, or even bird eggs. It was traded by weight, sometimes balanced against those same salt blocks in deals that were conducted silently. Yes, silently. The famous silent barter system worked like this. Traders from the north would leave their goods, salt, textiles, maybe glass beads, on the ground near a designated site. Then they'd move back. Local gold traders would approach, inspect the goods, leave gold dust if they were satisfied, and then retreat. If the northern traders agreed with the exchange, they'd take the gold and move on. If not, they'd wait for the offer to be increased. Why silent? Language barriers, sure, but also trust, ritual, and the need to avoid conflict in remote, lawless regions. The desert had no police, and into this silent economy came the camel, the true unsung hero of desert survival. Imported centuries earlier from Arabia, the dromedary camel, the one-hump variety, could carry over 300 pounds of goods for weeks without water. Its thick footpads made it ideal for the sand, and its ability to store fat and not water, contrary to popular belief, meant it could burn reserves to survive in the most hostile conditions. Every caravan required camel handlers, water managers, scouts, and guards. It wasn't a solo operation, it was a system, one that was dull, grueling, and relentless. Let's pause in the middle of a caravan, say 600 camels deep, marching southward from Sijil Masa. It's night. You've been walking for 13 hours. You're wrapped in layers to keep the cold out. The Sahara can plunge below freezing at night. You haven't seen anything but sand and bone for days. You eat a handful of dates. You sip a little water laced with ash or algae. You lie beside your camel and hope you don't get robbed or trampled. In the morning, you'll rise before the sun and start walking again. This is commerce in its least romantic form. Still, out of these journeys, towns began to flourish. Timbuktu, Gao, Jenne. These weren't cities in the European sense. They had no stone towers or cathedrals, but they had wealth, and they had knowledge. Because along with salt and gold came something even more powerful: books. As Islam spread through the region, so did a reverence for written knowledge. Traders didn't just bring textiles and spices, they brought scrolls, Quranic manuscripts, mathematical treatises, and medical texts. Scholars came in their wake, eager to teach and learn. Timbuktu's Sankore University eventually held thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, law, poetry, and philosophy. The image of the dark continent fades quickly here. These were not backward towns. These were intellectual centers where West African scholars debated theology and planetary motion centuries before European universities admitted their first black students. And while we'll explore more of Timbuktu's golden age in the next section, it's worth lingering here in the slow dawn of these towns, because the miracle wasn't the manuscripts, it was the survival, the patience, the sheer ability to thrive in a place where death could come from dehydration, theft, or misstep. Desert traders learned how to wrap themselves in indigo-dyed cloth that protected against sunburn and insects. They packed dried camel meat and powdered milk. They trained children to walk barefoot for weeks. They buried water caches along certain routes and memorized star positions by heart. This wasn't heroic. It wasn't dramatic. It was boring, repetitive, logistical. And that's exactly why it worked. You didn't survive the desert by improvising. You survived it by respecting it, by listening to the wind, by knowing which dunes were likely to shift overnight, by learning the shape of a vulture's flight, or how long you could go before your camel started frothing at the mouth. That knowledge didn't come from books. It came from mothers, uncles, caravan elders, and men who had walked the route 20 times. It was oral, lived, breathed, and it passed down through generations like sacred lore. But it was fragile too. One misplaced water cache, one sultan's bad political move, one raider band emboldened by a weak local guard, and trade collapsed. Entire cities vanished when a route shifted by just 200 miles. Even today, the ruins of places like Teg Daoust and Kombi Saleh sit half buried in sand, their names barely remembered, their houses crumbling in the wind. But at their peak, these towns were marvels of endurance. And so, before we press deeper into the world of books and scholars, let's sit here for a moment longer, beneath the starlit dome of a Saharan night, surrounded by saints, leaping camels, whispering wind, and the rhythmic breath of a caravan crew poised on the edge of the world. They won't move until first light, and neither will we. The camels arrive at noon, shimmering on the horizon like a mirage. Their bells jingle softly, a sound that echoes across the dusty flatlands around Timbuktu. They've been on the move for weeks, maybe months, and now they plod into the city with no fanfare, no ceremony, just exhaustion and routine. The lead camel sinks slowly to its knees. The trader dismounts, brushing dust from his beard. The crates are heavy, salt, manuscripts, textiles, sometimes even enslaved people. The unloading begins methodically, because there's a rhythm to this place. The rhythm of a town that grew not from conquest or kingship, but from waiting. Timbuktu was a city that waited, for gold, for knowledge, for the return of the rains. It didn't invent much. It didn't conquer, but it endured, and it watched. Let's talk about what it actually looked like. Forget the golden spires of European cathedrals or the sharp angles of Islamic minarets in North Africa. Timbuktu's skyline was humble. Adobe mosques, rounded and pitted by sandstorms, rising gently above flat-roofed homes. Narrow alleyways curved between walls made from banko, a mix of mud and straw that had to be replastered every year after the rains. Goats wandered freely. Dust settled on everything. And yet inside those walls, knowledge bloomed. The heart of Timbuktu wasn't the market square or the gold exchange. It was the Sankore Mosque. Built in the 14th century and later expanded into a full-fledged university, Sankore was less a school in the modern sense and more a network of scholarly circles. Students sat cross-legged in courtyards or shaded rooms, while teachers, called ulama, lectured from memory, often using just a single handwritten manuscript as a source. Subjects included Islamic law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and even logic. Many texts were in Arabic, but some included annotations in local languages like Songhai or Ta. Mashek. The knowledge passed between teacher and student wasn't just academic, it was spiritual. To study was to serve God. Manuscripts were sacred, and they were everywhere. Estimates vary wildly, but scholars believe Timbuktu may have housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts at its height. Families passed them down like heirlooms. Libraries existed inside homes, guarded jealously by scholars who refused to lend them, even to close friends. Some pages were illuminated with gold leaf, others were plain, worn, but still legible. And these manuscripts didn't just stay in Timbuktu. Traders carried them to and from Morocco, Egypt, and even the Ottoman Empire. Timbuktu had become an intellectual hub, but also a trade stop for ideas. So how did it get this way? Let's rewind again briefly to the 14th century. The Mali Empire is at its height, ruled by Mansa Musa, a name that might ring a bell because he's often cited as the wealthiest person in history. His 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca, complete with thousands of attendants and enough gold to destabilize the Cairo economy, put Mali, and by extension Timbuktu, on the medieval map. But wealth alone didn't make Timbuktu a scholarly haven. That came with a shift in identity. When Musa returned from Mecca, he brought back architects, scholars, and religious teachers. He commissioned the Jingwareba Mosque, still standing today, and set in motion a legacy of Islamic learning that stretched for centuries. Timbuktu wasn't the only city in the region to boast scholarship. Gao, Djenné, and Walata also had vibrant intellectual scenes, but Timbuktu's location, just far enough from imperial capitals to avoid heavy interference, but close enough to the caravan routes, made it ideal for autonomous scholarly growth. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the city was a jewel in the Songhai Empire, ruled by figures like Askia Muhammad, who continued to promote learning. Scholars from across West Africa and the broader Islamic world came to study or settle. Some became judges, advisors, or translators. Others simply copied manuscripts all day, their ink-stained fingers and frayed clothes hiding a quiet form of resistance, the preservation of knowledge in a shifting, unstable world. Let's take a moment to picture the daily life of a scholar in Timbuktu. You rise at dawn, just before the call to prayer. The wind carries sand through the cracks in your walls, and you have to shake the dust from your manuscript shelf. You light a small lamp, oil if you're lucky, and begin reading. Maybe you're a teacher, preparing for your students to arrive, or a scribe, copying a text from the 11th century. Your pen is made from reed, your ink from soot or crushed acacia pods. You'll write until the light fails. You live humbly. You own little. But you are part of a quiet tradition that believes knowledge, not conquest, not wealth, is the path to salvation. And yet, you worry. Because storms are coming. Political storms. Timbuktu's golden age didn't last. In 1591, a Moroccan army under the Saadian dynasty crossed the desert and sacked Timbuktu. The city had long paid tribute to North African powers, but the Moroccans wanted more. They wanted control of the gold trade itself. They didn't find what they expected. The caravan economy was fragile, decentralized, and the desert couldn't be ruled from a throne in Marrakesh. But the damage was done. The Moroccans imposed military governors, disrupted trade routes, and forcibly relocated many scholars to the north. The delicate web of trust that had allowed Timbuktu to flourish began to unravel. Caravans still came, but less frequently. The salt mines of Taga, Zay declined. Raids increased. The libraries remained, but with fewer readers. Still, the manuscripts survived. Carefully hidden in cellars, wrapped in leather, passed between families, they endured for centuries. Even today, Timbuktu's manuscripts remain one of the greatest and least understood treasures of African history. They reveal a world that defies stereotypes, a world of thinkers, theologians, astronomers, and poets. A world of intellectual rigor that never needed the stamp of European approval to matter. But why does it feel forgotten? Because deserts don't keep records in stone. They bury them in dust. Because scholarship without conquest is easy to ignore. Because cities like Timbuktu don't shout, they whisper. And now, centuries later, some of those whispers are still being heard. Projects to digitize. Timbuktu's manuscripts began in the 21st century. Families who hid their libraries for generations began to share them with scholars around the world. In 2012, when jihadist fighters threatened to destroy the libraries, brave locals smuggled thousands of texts out in secret, risking their lives to preserve their heritage. It's tempting to romanticize that bravery, but in truth, it's part of a long, unbroken chain. From the camel caravans to the candlelit scriptoriums, Timbuktu's legacy isn't about drama or spectacle. It's about resilience in stillness. So let's sit a little longer with that image. A single page, a quiet room, a trader walking slowly across the sand with a sack of books strapped to a camel's side, a student squinting at the faint lettering on a parchment written before his grandfather was born. No fame, no fanfare, just the quiet, repetitive act of preserving human thought. And as we drift deeper into this forgotten world, it leaves us with a question. In a place where memory is carried by wind and sand, who decides what survives? The wind doesn't stop in the Sahara. It's constant, a low sighing breath across an endless sea of sand. It wears down mountains, swallows roadways, and blurs the lines between past and present. It moves so slowly that you might not notice, until one day you realize that a city is gone. Timbuktu still exists, but its glory, like the dust that gathers in its alleyways, has settled. By the 18th century, the great caravan cities of the Sahara, Timbuktu, Gao, Walata, Djenné, were already fading from international view. The trade networks that once sustained them began to collapse, squeezed by shifting political powers, environmental instability, and new maritime routes that bypassed the desert entirely. Once the Mediterranean opened up to more reliable sea-based commerce, camel caravans looked less like the future and more like relics of a dying age. But decline in the desert is rarely sudden. It's slow, insidious, like sand piling up against a doorframe. Let's take Djenné as an example. This city, known for its stunning Great Mosque, was a vibrant commercial hub during the 13th and 14th centuries. Traders brought cloth, grain, and livestock from the savannah and salt from the desert. Its unique mud brick architecture made it instantly recognizable, even to visitors from far-off lands. But by the late 1600s, Djenné's role in the trans-Saharan network began to shrink. Its scholars moved on, its traders lost relevance. The Niger River's floods, once so vital for agriculture and trade, became less predictable. The silt built up, roads became impassable for months, and so Djenné stayed where it was. But the world moved on. It's important to understand something here. The Sahara didn't just host cities, it devoured them. Look at Tad Mecca, once a thriving node in early Islamic trade, mentioned by Arab geographers in the 10th century. It's gone now. Archaeologists believe they've found it, half buried in sand in eastern Mali. But no walls remain standing. No minarets mark the skyline. Just fragments of pottery, rusted iron tools, and the suggestion of streets worn away by time. Even Tagaza, the salt mine that once anchored so much of the caravan trade, didn't die from lack of salt. It died because the salt stopped moving. Armies disrupted routes. Rival powers imposed impossible taxes. Raids increased. Eventually, traders found other mines. The bones of slaves who worked Tagaza's pits still lie beneath the dunes. The salt slabs, too, still sit abandoned in places, hewn, stacked, and never collected. What really killed these cities wasn't just empire or economy. It was disconnection. The caravan system worked because every node on the route was a lifeline. No one city could stand alone. If one collapsed, say because of drought or plague or political upheaval, it was like cutting a thread in a spider web. The others felt it, and they slowly unraveled. Still, people remained. And that's the quieter story, the one that doesn't make it into textbooks. As the cities shrank, the people didn't vanish. They adapted. They reoriented their trade locally. Some turned to subsistence farming. Others moved to coastal towns as European presence increased. Some held on to their manuscripts, their prayer routines, their fading libraries. They passed stories down orally. They memorized genealogies. They preserved what they could, even as the world ignored them. By the 19th century, European explorers were arriving in Timbuktu, not to learn, but to marvel. In 1826, Scottish explorer Alexander Gordon Laing became the first known European to reach the city, though he didn't live long enough to share much of what he saw. A few years later, René Caillier, A Frenchman disguised as a Muslim traveler reached the city and described it in detail. He found it disappointing, dusty, impoverished, quiet. He expected gold. He found goats. And yet what he missed, what so many missed, was the ghost of something more profound, a culture of endurance. Let's pause here to consider the idea of survival in stillness. We often think of resilience in terms of motion, action, struggle. But in the Sahara, survival meant the opposite. It meant waiting for water, for trade, for caravans, for the rains to come and for the sandstorms to pass. It meant persistence without promise. And over time, these places didn't disappear because they were weak. They faded because the world around them changed, faster than a camel could walk. Still, echoes remain. Walk through Timbuktu today, and you'll still see the Djingareba Mosque, its buttressed walls repaired every year by hand using ancient techniques. You'll find hidden libraries, some with manuscripts dating back 1,000 years. You'll hear the local children reciting verses in Arabic, sitting on mats, just like the students of old. And you'll see the desert slowly reclaiming its own. In 2012, when jihadist fighters aligned with Al-Qaeda swept through northern Mali, they targeted Timbuktu's cultural heritage. They burned libraries, smashed shrines, and desecrated graves. It was a shock to the world, but not to Timbuktu's residents. They had seen invaders before, and once again, they resisted not with swords, but with silence and planning. Locals worked quickly. Under the cover of night, they packed thousands of manuscripts into metal trunks, cloth sacks, even boxes of rice. They smuggled them downriver, past checkpoints, and into safer cities like Bamako. Over 90% of the manuscripts were saved. And you wonder, how does a city, long dismissed as a footnote, have such courage? Because its story isn't built on monuments or empires. It's built on memory. And here's where the boredom returns, because the true weight of history in the Sahara doesn't come from its drama, but from its routine. Imagine the countless traders who tied up their sandals and stepped into bleat, staring heat for a 2-month walk across open desert. The scribes who spent years copying a single book by hand, page by careful page. The scholars who paused mid-lecture to swat flies, then resumed discussing theology without missing a beat. The brickmakers who reshaped their city's walls every year before the rainy season, again and again and again. Boring? Maybe. But that boring repetition, unnoticed by kings, unrecorded by empires, is the reason these cities lasted for centuries longer than they should have. They didn't build towers. They built habits. And long after the last caravan crossed the dunes, those habits kept people alive. So now, as we draw this journey across the sand to a close, we return to a simple truth. The desert doesn't forget. It buries. It obscures. It waits. And underneath the sand lie the bones of traders, the ashes of fires long gone, and the words of scholars no one remembers, but whose thoughts may one day be read again. And maybe that's the quiet lesson of the caravan cities, that what truly endures isn't the market, it's not the palace, it's not even the salt. It's the slow, stubborn survival of people who refuse to be erased. And tonight, somewhere in northern Mali, the wind is still blowing. The camels are fewer now, the traders long gone, but the sand remembers. And so do we. Story 3. The Paper War, Bureaucracy, Borders, and the Battle for the World's Most Boring Territory. Now let's gently leave the scorched winds of the Sahara and drift eastward toward a stranger kind of desert, a place not carved by caravan trade or ancient scholarship, but by bureaucratic error. And unlike most of Earth's disputed land, this one has a curious twist. No one wants it. Welcome to Bur Tawil, a dusty triangle of land on the border of Egypt and Sudan. It is, quite possibly, the most disputed, undisputed land in modern history, precisely because both countries refuse to claim it. Picture it. 2,060 square kilometers of arid scrubland, no roads, no towns, no real infrastructure, and no permanent inhabitants. Not a drop of oil, not a grain of strategic interest. Just a beige smear on satellite maps between two countries who would rather argue about another patch of desert entirely. And somehow, despite its lack of resources or population, Bir Tawil has become one of the weirdest case studies in geopolitical survival through paperwork. Let's unravel this. In 1899, the Anglo-Egyptian condominium was established when Britain and Egypt decided to jointly administer Sudan. At that time, colonial powers often drew borders using a highly advanced tool, a ruler. The 22nd parallel north was selected as the official boundary between Egypt and Sudan. Neat, straight, British. But in 1902, just 3 years later, colonial officials made a correction, kind of. They realized that some local tribes in the area below the 22nd parallel, like the Ababda, had historically aligned more with Egypt. So they adjusted the border southward in a jagged line that didn't match the 1899 version. This left two disputed zones. The Hala-Ib Triangle, about 20,500 square kilometers of Red Sea coastline, north of the 22nd parallel. It's much larger, more fertile, more accessible, and far pertivicious, more strategically valuable, and Bir Tawil, a smaller, parched triangle south of the 22nd parallel. Now here's the absurd twist. Egypt claims the 1899 border, because that gives them Hala-Ib. Sudan claims the 1902 border, because that gives them Hala-Ib. But both borders can't be claimed at once. If Egypt insists on the 1899 boundary, they must give up Bir Tawil. If Sudan pushes for the 1902 map, they too forfeit Bir Tawil. So in trying to claim Hala-Ib, both countries have to simultaneously reject Bir Tawil. And that's how a piece of land ends up with no legal owner. Bir Tawil is one of the few places on Earth not claimed by any recognized country. It's not a no-man's land due to warfare, nor a demilitarized zone like the DMZ in Korea. It is simply left out. Think about that. A modern, bureaucratic orphan, a child of incompatible colonial charts. And so Bir Tawil sits there, dry and unchanging, with no passport office, no flag, and no one checking who comes and goes. For the most part, no one does. But occasionally, just occasionally, someone tries to claim it. One of the earliest modern attempts came in 2014, when a man named Jeremiah Heaton, a farmer from Virginia, decided to make his daughter a princess. He had read about Bir Tawil and saw an opportunity. So he flew to Egypt, journeyed out to the region, planted a flag, and declared himself the ruler of the Kingdom of North Sudan, a sovereign monarchy with his daughter as crown princess. He later tried to launch agricultural projects, fundraise for a micronation, and even spark a social movement. International law, of course, ignored him. So did the United Nations. But he wasn't the only one. Over the years, Bir Tawil has been claimed by would-be monarchs, libertarian idealists, internet pranksters, and even crypto bros attempting to build utopian blockchain societies. No one has succeeded. Because, no matter how unclaimed Bir Tawil may seem, you can't just take land. Not even when two countries are actively avoiding it. There's a term for this in international law, terra nullius, land belonging to no one. It's a concept more theoretical than practical in today's world. The age of imperial land grabs has, at least in theory, ended. You can't just find a rock in the ocean and declare yourself king, not without consequence. So Bir Tawil remains what it is, a blank space. And yet, that blank space is surrounded by remarkable activity. Let's zoom out a little. To the north, the Hala-Ib Triangle is actively contested. Egypt has deployed military infrastructure, run elections, and maintained de facto control. Sudan protests occasionally, but without much escalation. It's a standoff, but a bureaucratic one. To the south, Sudan continues to struggle with economic crises, drought, political unrest, and border insecurity. And in the midst of all this, Bir Tawil quietly exists, ignored, uninhabited, unpatrolled. But someone is always watching. Satellite images show faint tracks in the dirt, likely made by nomadic herders or adventurous prospectors. A few travelers, mostly modern-day adventurers looking for bragging rights, have posted photographs online, posing with makeshift flags and GPS coordinates. Still, you won't find rest stops, water wells or signposts. No welcome signs, no national slogans, no guards. The nearest real infrastructure lies hundreds of kilometers away. If you broke down in Bir Tawil, it would be a long wait before anyone noticed. And this brings us to a deeper truth about borders. We think of them as lines on a map, sharp, clear, defining. But most borders are illusions of permanence, drawn by distant powers, maintained by paperwork, and enforced only when it suits someone. Bir Tawil is a glitch in that illusion, a place that defies the logic of ownership, a territory shaped entirely by what people don't want, rather than what they do. Its survival as a no man's land says more about human systems than it does about geography. It reminds us that much of international politics is, at its core, paperwork. Colonial administrators drawing lines in sand with pencils, diplomatic envoys arguing over decimal points, treaties signed in one language and translated poorly into another. Centuries later, that paperwork still casts long shadows. It can create conflict or prevent it. And in rare cases, it creates a desert triangle that time forgot. So as you lay there tonight, picture Bir Tawil beneath the stars. No lights, no cities, just dust, silence, and the memory of a forgotten border. And ask yourself, what does it mean for a place to be so unwanted that it becomes invisible? What might exist there, waiting, unnoticed, simply because no one bothered to look? Let's stay a little longer in this triangle of silence, this uninhabited gap in the map called Bir Tawil. On paper, it is empty. No citizens, no claims, no recognized ownership. A place lost between two competing maps. But reality, as always, doesn't quite match what the paperwork says. Though no state claims Bir Tawil, that does not mean no one has ever crossed it. It just means their presence was never officially noted. There are no immigration records, no census, no border patrols. But if you speak to the tribes of the Ababda and the Bisharin, nomadic groups whose ancestors have roamed this region long before lines were ever drawn on paper, you'll get a different story. They don't think of Bir Tawil as unclaimed. They don't think of it as abandoned. To them, it is simply part of the world they've always known. And herein lies the most boring but quietly powerful truth. Borders aren't just lines, they're lived experiences. The people the maps forgot, the Ababda tribe, traditionally aligned with southern Egypt, and the Bisharin, connected more closely to northern Sudan, have moved through this region for centuries. They are not concerned with straight lines drawn in British offices. They follow paths dictated by survival, the location of grazing land, the availability of water, the rhythm of the seasons. Their camels and goats do not recognize the 22nd parallel, and in a way, neither do they. Nomadic groups have always complicated modern border systems. Bureaucracies crave definition. They need boundaries, signatures, stamps, records. But desert societies live in movement. Their territories are not fixed. They expand and contract with the rains, the soil, the winds. In many ways, the triangle of Bir Tawil is a monument to how colonial maps ignored lived geography. It's not just that the land was empty. It's that the people who lived there didn't show up on the kind of map that imperial bureaucrats could understand. No cities, no permanent structures, no tax records. To them, that meant no value. And yet, for generations, herders crossed through Bir Tawil, stopping near seasonal watering holes. Hunters tracked game. Some families might pass through for days at a time, using the land as a corridor rather than a destination. Occasionally, those travelers would encounter strangers, not soldiers or border guards, but in recent decades, outsiders with GPS devices and big ideas. The would-be monarchs and micronations. Since the early 2000s, Bir Tawil has gained a strange sort of cult status online. It's one of the last places on Earth where you can, in theory, claim a kingdom. Of course, this idea doesn't hold up under legal scrutiny. The principle of uti possidetis juris, used in international law, locks in colonial borders as the official ones recognized by the global community. Meaning, just because no one wants it doesn't mean it's available. Still, that hasn't stopped people from trying. Let's take a few examples from the archives of weird history. In 2011, a group calling itself the Kingdom of Dixit laid claim to Bir Tawil, complete with a website, a flag, and a mock government structure. It fizzled quickly, like most micronations, into digital dust. In 2017, an Indian man declared it the Kingdom of the Snake, citing environmental and spiritual reasons. He wrote letters to the UN. The UN never replied. Around the same time, libertarians and crypto enthusiasts began floating the idea of building a free trade micronation there, a tax haven in the desert, backed by Bitcoin, governed by code, and free from bureaucracy. But Bir Tawil had no Wi-Fi, no water, and no shade. The project never moved beyond a white paper. And of course there was Jeremiah Heaton, whose daughter briefly reigned over the Kingdom of North, Sudan, in bedtime stories and Kickstarter proposals. But no flag has remained, because there are no roads to Bir Tawil, no state power to prop up a claim, and more importantly, no one cares enough to dispute it, which, legally, is a huge problem. To have a state, you need 4 things, according to the Montevideo Convention of 1933. A permanent population, a defined territory, a government, the capacity to enter into relations with other states. Bir Tawil has none of these. And the people who pass through it, the Ababda, the Bisharin, do not seek to create a nation-state. They don't plant flags. They don't draw borders. They simply endure, as they have for centuries. And perhaps that's the great irony. In an era of hyper-nationalism, digital maps and hyper-connected borders, the most enduring presence in Bir Tawil is the quiet, non-statist life of desert nomads, living entirely outside the systems that created the problem in the first place. The strategic non-importance of Bir Tawil. Why hasn't this turned into a full-blown international standoff? Because Bir Tawil has nothing anyone wants. No oil, no ports, no minerals, not even a tree for shade. It's hot, it's dry, and it's inconvenient. There have been brief murmurs, mostly from amateur geologists, of possible gold deposits in the surrounding mountains, but nothing extensive has ever been confirmed. No one's invested serious time or money in prospecting the region. Meanwhile, both Egypt and Sudan continue to focus their attention on the Halaib Triangle, the much larger and strategically valuable territory to the east. Halaib sits on the Red Sea coast, and access to shipping lanes, natural resources, and fishing rights makes it worth fighting over. Bir Tawil. It's a bureaucratic leftover, a footnote to a century-old paperwork dispute. And that's precisely why it has become a symbol. A symbol of how fragile our systems of ownership really are, and how sometimes it's not war or revolution. On that redraws the map. It's a missed memo, an outdated map, or 2 colonial officers working off different instructions. Silence, stamps, and the absurdity of modern borders. Borders can start wars. But more often, they start conversations about identity, power, migration, and the rights of people to move or stay. Bir Tawil is mostly silent in that conversation, but its existence raises a quiet, unnerving question. What happens when nobody wants a land? What does it mean to be a territory without a nation? Most of the world's border disputes come from the opposite problem: too many people claiming the same land. In Kashmir, Palestine, Western Sahara, Crimea, the South China Sea, there is pain, politics, and often violence. But Bir Tawil stands as a blank, not because it's peaceful, but because it was simply not included in anyone's version of the future. That exclusion, ironically, gives it a strange kind of freedom. And in a world where territory is so often tied to conflict, perhaps Bir Tawil's greatest power is its irrelevance. No taxes, no checkpoints, no national anthems, just sky, sand, and the occasional footprints of someone passing through. Tonight, somewhere in that triangle of unclaimed dust, the stars are overhead. The wind slides across the plain, and someone, a traveler, a herder, or maybe no one at all, is moving quietly beneath a sky that doesn't care where borders lie. And maybe that's the lesson. That borders are not as real as we think. That they are drawn, redrawn, forgotten and remembered, sometimes with guns, sometimes with maps, and sometimes not at all. And somewhere between Egypt and Sudan, that forgotten space endures. Because sometimes, the most profound places in history aren't the ones that shaped the world. They're the ones that the world accidentally left behind. Let's take one last quiet walk through Bir Tawil. The sun here doesn't rise with any urgency. It just emerges, stretching long fingers of light across sand, rock and scrub that no one truly governs. In every official sense, Bir Tawil does not belong to anyone. But the truth, like the sand underfoot, shifts constantly. Tonight, we're going to look at what it means to have territory that nobody wants, and how that very absence of ownership becomes a mirror for the world's deepest geopolitical assumptions. Because while Bir Tawil might feel like the most boring strip of land ever designated by a cartographer's pen, its story continues to haunt border studies, international law, and the messy ways in which humans pretend to control space. And quietly, behind that silence, is a question still unresolved. Can something exist in the human world without being owned? When the land refuses to fit, it's rare for a territory to not be claimed by a nation. In fact, the UN recognizes virtually no truly unclaimed land. Even Antarctica is divided into zones of overlapping sovereign interest, governed by international treaties. So when a place like Bir Tawil resists categorization, it doesn't just become an anomaly, it becomes a problem. International law thrives on definition. It needs clarity, lines, signatures, recognized stamps of statehood. So when a 2,000 square kilometer desert plot can't be cleanly assigned, legal scholars take notice. It isn't because Bir Tawil is valuable. It's because it challenges the idea that all land must be part of something. In that sense, Bir Tawil is less a triangle of dirt and more a legal ghost. A quiet rebuke to the idea that nation-states are universal or inevitable. It's not the only anomaly in the world, of course. There are other border oddities, territories with uncertain status like Marie Byrd Land in Antarctica, the largest unclaimed territory on Earth, which remains untouched due to the 1959 Antarctic Treaty. The Hala-Ib Triangle, just to Bir Tawil's east, claimed by both Sudan and Egypt, unlike its quieter neighbor. Point Roberts, Washington, an exclave of the US only accessible through Canada. The Northwest Angle in Minnesota, the accidental result of a cartographic error during treaty negotiations with Britain in the 18th century. But none have Bir Tawil's strange distinction, a land not only ungoverned, but actively disowned by both bordering nations. This isn't a frozen wasteland, or a zone under military contest, or a diplomatic grey area. It's a place that exists purely because two governments decided not to claim it, each fearing the loss of a more strategic prize if they did. In its own quiet way, Bir Tawil is what happens when bureaucracy reaches its own logical conclusion and chooses not to bother. The digital colonizers. Bir Tawil in the Internet age. In recent years, Bir Tawil has taken on a second life, not in embassies or legal books, but online. A new wave of interest has emerged, not from academics or diplomats, but from Internet adventurers, YouTubers, Reddit theorists, Discord micronation planners, even travel bloggers. They are drawn to Bir Tawil not because of its geopolitical nuance, but because of its narrative appeal. No man's land. A blank on the map. A place where, in theory, you could plant a flag and call yourself king. For a certain type of idealist, usually Western, often young, and frequently libertarian, this desert triangle becomes a fantasy canvas, a place to imagine escape from the burdens of modern regulation, taxes, and laws. The irony, of course, is sharp. The same systems they wish to escape, property rights, international recognition, border protections, are exactly what prevent their plans from succeeding. Every founding of a Bir Tawil's micronation so far has failed for the same reasons. No permanent residence to support statehood, no infrastructure to sustain even basic life, no recognition from existing countries, and most importantly, no legitimacy in the eyes of international law. In short, the fantasy of claiming Bir Tawil collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. To make something yours, you have to prove it functions like a state. But if it functions like a state, it's no longer free of governance. And so, one by one, the would-be kings and queens have left, leaving behind digital kingdoms and half-finished websites. The land remains, silent, untouched, and still unclaimed. The human cost of border errors. But while Bir Tawil might seem like a harmless bureaucratic curiosity, the story of its creation is rooted in the same colonial logic that disrupted, and in many cases devastated, lives across Africa. The British colonial officials who drew the 1899 and 1902 borders did not consult the people who lived there. They were not concerned with tribal boundaries, migratory patterns, or ancestral lands. They were focused on administrative convenience. Maps were drawn in London, not Aswan, not Khartoum. This wasn't unique to Egypt and Sudan. Throughout Africa, colonial boundaries split communities, forced nomadic groups into artificial borders, and placed warring factions under the same flag. In many cases, the consequences were violent. Civil wars, genocide, stateless populations. Bir Tawil in this context is almost lucky. It caused no war, no displacement. But that's not because the system worked. It's because, for once, nobody cared enough to fight. And that silence, that lack of conflict, hides the fact that the same flawed system that created Bir Tawil also birthed some of the bloodiest border disputes of the 20th century. Bir Tawil, then, becomes not just a curiosity, but a symbol of everything wrong with how borders have been imposed, not chosen. The future of a land without a flag. So, what happens now? It's unlikely Egypt or Sudan will claim Bir Tawil anytime soon. Doing so could weaken their competing cases for the Halayib Triangle. And even if one of them did, it's doubtful the world would care. There's no strategic reason to invest resources into an empty desert triangle. The diplomatic cost would outweigh the benefits. It's more valuable, politically, to leave it untouched. That means Bir Tawil will likely remain as it is. A bureaucratic ghost, a legal puzzle, a lonely triangle. But perhaps its value lies not in possession, but in what it teaches. It forces us to confront the absurdity of some geopolitical truths, that the most rigid systems of control can be undone by a simple mapping mistake, that sovereignty isn't about flags, it's about who's willing to claim responsibility, that sometimes Silence is more permanent than war. And maybe, just maybe, Bir Tawil's very lack of drama is what gives it meaning. It didn't witness battles. It didn't generate treaties or trigger revolutions. It just existed, quietly, persistently, in defiance of everything we think a nation needs. And tonight, as the wind moves across that open, indifferent landscape, you can imagine a traveler walking the sand. No passport, no flag, no destination, just motion, just space. No checkpoints, no bureaucracy, only the land, only the stars. So the next time you look at a map and see the neat borders, the sharp lines, the tidy color blocks, remember that somewhere between Egypt and Sudan, a triangle sits outside all that. Not because it's special, but because somewhere in the filing cabinets of empires, someone forgot to care. And that, in a way, might be the most honest form of peace we've ever known. Story 4. The kingdom that was mostly paperwork. The administrative life of the Habsburg Empire. As we leave the sands of Bir Tawil behind, let's step into an entirely different kind of forgotten terrain. Not one of deserts, but of desks. Wooden ones, covered in wax seals, ink blotters, and paperwork so vast and labyrinthine it could bury entire generations of clerks. Tonight, we find ourselves wandering through the silent, paper-stuffed hallways of one of Europe's most peculiar political creations, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a realm so vast and so weirdly constructed that it often seemed less like a country and more like an elaborate filing system held together by stamps, signatures, and the stubborn will of imperial bureaucracy. At its height in the late 19th century, the Austro-Hungarian Empire sprawled across modern-day Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, parts of Italy, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia. But despite its physical mass, its actual structure was a masterpiece of administrative indecision. And tonight, we'll begin with the backbone of it all, the paperwork. Because when you ruled over dozens of ethnic groups, languages, alphabets, religions, and competing aristocracies, your most powerful weapon wasn't a sword. It was a registry ledger. The Empire of Forms. Let's set the scene. It's the year 1895, and you're a mid-level postal clerk in the bohemian town of Pilsen. You're fluent in Czech, naturally, but you're expected to read German, handle forms in Hungarian, and occasionally decipher documents in Italian, Ruthenian, or Croatian. You begin your shift not with action, but with a check of stamps, not postage stamps, but bureaucratic authorization stamps. Each department has its own seal. The seal must be inked just so. Slight smudges could delay a request for 3 weeks. If the wrong color ink is us, Ed, the form is void. Today, a farmer has come in to register the death of his father. You open Form 37D, Declaration of Family Death, Rural Male. But he filled out Form 38B, Declaration of Family Death, Urban Male, by mistake. You now have to file a misapplication Form 7K, send it to Prague, await the official correction letter, and only then can you begin the actual death registration process. This may take 10 days. And while you're processing that, you receive a shipment of census sheets, each one printed in 12 languages, folded carefully into a stack, with a strict order of submission. German, because Vienna. Hungarian, because Budapest. Czech, Polish, Ruthenian, and Slovak, to keep peace. Croatian, Serbian, Slovene, and Romanian, because they asked nicely. Italian, begrudgingly. Every official interaction, from marriages to road repairs, required separate forms per region, each translated, signed, witnessed, and delivered by hand or rail. By 1900, the empire had over 200,000 state employees, many of whom did nothing but process documents all day long. They didn't just run the empire. They were the empire. Language and the bureaucratic maze. One of the most exhausting and quietly impressive elements of Austro-Hungarian life was its linguistic acrobatics. The 1867 Compromise, which gave Hungary its autonomy, had already split the empire into two administrative halves, Austria and Hungary, each with its own parliament, bureaucracy, and language preferences. But that was just the beginning. The empire officially recognized 11 major languages and nearly 20 spoken dialects. These weren't ornamental acknowledgements. They had to be accounted for in everything from government paperwork to military commands. In Galicia, modern-day Western Ukraine and Poland, Ruthenian peasants received legal notices printed in Cyrillic, while Polish-speaking nobles insisted on Latin characters. In Croatia, parliamentary debates could begin in Hungarian and end in German, if they ended at all. The result: government clerks were trained to function as multilingual transcription machines, flipping from language to language as needed. In some cities, a single office might process complaints in 5 alphabets before lunch. To navigate this, Vienna issued endless bureaucratic guidelines, such as which language had primacy on railway signs, German in Austria, Hungarian in Hungary. The order of translation on birth certificates, local language first, imperial language second. What kind of paper could be used for official proclamations in Orthodox versus Catholic districts? This sounds dizzying, and it was, but it also made the empire strangely modern. By accommodating multiple languages, the Austro-Hungarian system anticipated multicultural governance in a way few empires had. But it came at a cost: speed. Legislation took months to pass because every clause had to be translated, debated in different languages, and checked for potential offense. It was like running a country via group email on dial-up. The emperors of ink and filing. Behind every Kaiser, Franz Joseph stood not just ministers and generals, but legions of clerks. While military officials drew maps and politicians gave speeches, it was the anonymous scribes who kept the machine going. Filing land disputes in Galicia, tabulating census results in Zagreb, calculating taxes owed by a bakery in Transylvania, approving construction permits for a barn in Bukovina. Entire ministries existed just to audit other ministries. One famous case involved the Ministry of Agriculture accidentally taxing a forest as urban land for 3 years. When the error was discovered, they convened 4 subcommittees to determine if a correction would violate the Fiscal Forest Protocols of 1878. They eventually decided not to fix it. Too much paperwork. Another case saw a man's petition for a new water pump take 21 years to process. By the time it was approved, the man had died, and his great-nephew inherited the pump rights, only to discover the village had already installed 3 others. This level of sluggishness didn't just amuse outsiders, it defined the empire's image. Writers like Franz Kafka, himself a minor insurance clerk in Prague, turned this bureaucratic machinery into a kind of literary horror. Kafka's fictional characters wander endlessly through government corridors, unable to get clear answers or even know who's in charge. It wasn't satire. It was Tuesday. Paper as power. But the empire's bureaucracy wasn't just inefficient. It was also profoundly stabilizing. Because when you govern dozens of nations without shared ethnicity, religion, or politics, paperwork became a form of fairness. No matter who you were, Czech brewer, Romanian shepherd, Jewish bookseller, you had the right to file a complaint. That complaint might take 6 months to be heard. But the form existed. In a strange way, the bureaucracy created the illusion of justice, if not justice itself. And this mattered. It allowed the empire to function without mass rebellions for far longer than many expected. Because behind the confusion was a principle. You could be heard, eventually. Paperwork wasn't just about rules. It was about belonging to a system, no matter how slow. The cracks beneath the folders. But as the 20th century crept closer, the machine began to show strain. Nationalist movements, especially in Hungary, the Czech lands, and the Balkans, started to reject the idea of imperial unity altogether. They didn't want fair paperwork. They wanted sovereignty. And the empire's answer? More committees. As World War I approached, the Austro-Hungarian government tried to hold everything together by expanding bureaucracy even further. New ethnic advisory councils were created. More languages were added to ballots. Special linguistic grievance commissions were formed to mediate local disputes. It was a paper flood. But no amount of stamps could stop the larger forces at play. By 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, the empire had already become a paradox, a place where paperwork was efficient enough to delay collapse, but not strong enough to prevent it. And so tonight, you find yourself seated at one of those dusty desks. Ink well, wooden chair, lantern light flickering overhead. A complaint form is half filled in front of you. It's written in German, but the petitioner speaks Slovene. There's a box you don't know how to check, and a signature line that wraps awkwardly around the edge. In the distance, trains carry troops to the front. But here, in this office, everything still moves slowly, carefully, deliberately. Because in the Habsburg Empire, the war might change the borders, but the forms still have to be filed. Let's drift further into the empire, past the dusty provincial post offices and echoing ministries, and into another essential layer of Austro-Hungarian life, the military. But not the romanticized version of galloping hussars and gleaming sabres. No, tonight we'll focus on the quieter and far less glamorous soldiers of the empire. The military clerks, quartermasters, logistics planners, and officer scribes whose main battlefield was often the ledger book. Because in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, even the army had its own administrative army. And if you ever found yourself drafted, not into combat, but into the war of paperwork, you'd quickly discover that fighting in uniform could mean sorting boots, decoding pay schedules, and proofreading orders translated into 5 languages. Let's begin with a typical recruit's experience in the late 19th century. You're a young man from a rural district in southern Slovakia. You speak Slovak and maybe some Hungarian. You've been conscripted into the army of the dual monarchy. Your draft notice arrives not in one language, but 3: German, Hungarian, and your local dialect. At first it's confusing. Then comes a flurry of forms: health clearances, domicile confirmations, family exemptions, and employer affidavits. Most are stamped by multiple offices. Some require you to travel to the county seat just to confirm your date of birth. And all of this happens before you ever receive a rifle. The language of orders. One of the central challenges of the Austro-Hungarian military was this: how do you issue a command that 20 different ethnic groups can understand? The answer was a compromise of contradictions. Official military commands were issued in German, the language of the Imperial Army. But Hungarian units used Magyar. Croatian units spoke Croatian. Officers were expected to learn multiple languages depending on where they served. Regulations were painstakingly translated and issued in thick-bound volumes. Consider the 1895 Austro-Hungarian Army Regulation Manual, a 1,200-page behemoth printed in 10 language editions, with a color-coded index to cross-reference specific paragraphs between them. Each new policy required a central draft, usually in German, verification by a multilingual legal review board, official translations into Hungarian, Czech, Slovene, Serbo-Croatian, Polish, Ruthenian, Romanian, and Italian. Approval by the War Ministry in both Vienna and Budapest. In short, issuing a regulation about the color of cavalry trousers could take months. Now imagine trying to coordinate a mobilization order. The draft, decoded, military conscription was mandatory across the empire. But how it was implemented varied by region, ethnicity, and political whim. The empire was split into KUK, Kaiserlich, und Königlich, for the Imperial Royal Army, and KU, Königlich Ungarisch, for the Hungarian half. These overlapping forces maintained their own recruitment offices, uniforms, and even musical styles for military bands. Every eligible young man was required to report to a local draft board, staffed by regional clerks who had to determine whether the recruit had any family exemptions, a Jejun only surviving son, caretaker of elderly parents, if the recruit had health issues, confirmed by imperial doctors, which unit he would serve in, based not only on geography, but ethnicity and language proficiency. Some units were ethnically mixed, others segregated. A Ruthenian-speaking peasant might be sent to serve under a German-speaking officer, with orders translated by a Hungarian-speaking adjutant. This led to delays, confusion, and at times, tragic miscommunication. One infamous incident during army training in the 1880s involved a unit composed of Slovak, German, and Croatian recruits. Command to cease fire was misunderstood by one section, resulting in continued live fire drills for 20 minutes after the order was issued. The solution: the War Office established a standard set of drill commands taught phonetically across all language groups. Every recruit had to memorize them, even if they didn't understand what they meant. Logistics and lateness. Supplying an army this diverse meant coordinating food, uniforms and equipment for hundreds of thousands of men across snow-covered mountains, swampy lowlands, and poorly connected villages. But again, this wasn't done with trucks or instant messaging. It was done with supply requisition forms, inventory ledgers, and transport timetables scribbled in pencil. Let's say your unit needed new boots. Here's how the process might unfold. The regimental quartermaster submits Form M121, footwear requisition, autumn, non-tropical. This is forwarded to the regional supply depot, where a clerk verifies your unit's current boot count against the Imperial Uniform Ledger. If approved, the request is sent to the Ministry of War Supply in Vienna. Boots are assigned a transport order via rail or river barge, depending on your location. Delivery is confirmed by Form S209. Final delivery verification, leather goods, standard issue. Average time, 6 to 12 weeks. Delays were common. One report from 1904 details a Hungarian infantry battalion receiving left-foot boots only, due to a packaging error that wasn't caught until the soldiers were already marching. Another tells of a Romanian-speaking unit mistakenly issued Polish winter coats 3 sizes too small because the form was filled out using the wrong language code. Still, even with the chaos, the Empire kept trying. Quartermasters were trained in mathematical accounting. Officers studied logistics in specialized academies. Procurement officers toured factories across the Empire to ensure that saddle straps, rifle barrels, and belt buckles were all up to spec, and documented it in triplicate. UNIF, Arms and Identity. Interestingly, the Empire's obsession with paperwork extended even into what soldiers wore. Uniform regulations were so complex that many officers carried small illustrated booklets showing correct configurations, down to button spacing and insignia color. Each regiment had a unique combination of tunic color, pant stripe, cap shape, insignia design, regional badge. This wasn't just fashion, it was identity. When a soldier from Moravia saw another from Bosnia, he could recognize his origin, rank, and branch of service at a glance. But the logistics of maintaining these variations, exhausting. Depot managers had to keep separate inventories for every uniform variation. Tailors were issued regiment-specific sewing instructions. Even socks came in multiple approved patterns depending on climate and unit designation. When Central Command tried to standardize uniforms in 1908, backlash from Hungarian officers led to a compromise: standard tunics, but customizable headgear. Of course, this required new forms to authorize every local exception. The quiet collapse. By the time World War I erupted, the Austro-Hungarian army had grown to over 7 million soldiers, and with them came an even greater army of paper pushers. War planning required vast stores of information, troop strengths, fuel supplies, tunnel blueprints, diplomatic ciphers, ration schedules, even grain forecasts for occupied Serbia. And yet, despite this preparation, the cracks showed almost immediately. Mobilization orders were delayed because some regiments didn't receive the correct stamp to finalize deployment. Officers received outdated maps. One division famously missed its train because the timetable hadn't been updated after a bureaucratic reshuffling of regional depots. In Serbia, Austrian troops entered battle lacking coordinated intelligence because each front reported to a different headquarters, each with its own filing system. In the end, it wasn't just military weakness or battlefield losses that doomed the empire. It was administrative overreach. The empire had built a military designed to manage complexity, not confront chaos. And chaos came anyway. So now, imagine yourself again, not as a general, but as a clerk. You're in a cramped field tent just behind the lines. The battle rages somewhere far away. Your task tonight? Cross-check the inventory of field kitchens against the last week's fuel shipments. You're missing 4 barrels of kerosene, and no one knows where they went. You dip your pen in ink. You fill out Form F332. The gunfire echoes faintly, but your world is one of numbers and notes. You don't fight the war. You document it. Because in the Habsburg Empire, even the apocalypse came with paperwork. Imagine the sound of rubber stamps slapping parchment, quills scratching across requisitions, the soft whir of a ceiling fan in some provincial office above an overworked civil servant's desk. Now imagine all of that continuing, even as the empire itself quietly dies outside the window. Tonight, we close the chapter on the Habsburg Empire, not in dramatic revolutions or final cavalry charges, but in dimly lit administrative offices overwhelmed by forms, translation errors, and supply chains that had grown too tangled to follow. Because the Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't just fall, it expired under the weight of its own forms. Let's return for a moment to Vienna in 1917. The Great War is in full motion. The empire is fighting battles on half a dozen fronts. Food shortages are reaching the capital. Railways are breaking down, but inside the War Ministry, the lights still burn late into the night. An undersecretary is reviewing a memo. The Croatian Army Corps has requested a revision to its rifle maintenance schedule. He sighs. The form is incomplete. It's missing the Hungarian language certification from Budapest. He sends it back. Office is still open. As the war dragged on, the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy became both the scaffolding and the shadow of the dying empire. Regional governors wrote daily reports, even as postal routes failed, and the recipients of their letters had already fled or been killed. Military commanders issued orders to divisions that no longer existed. Tax bureaus recalculated collection quotas, even though inflation had rendered the crown nearly worthless. Some clerks, it seems, simply couldn't stop. They stamped documents long after the departments they served had been dissolved. Like bureaucratic ghosts, they haunted old buildings in Lemberg, Krakow, and Graz, continuing to work in silence. Even as trains no longer arrived, even as telegraph wires went cold, even as the empire fell apart. In Prague, one overzealous registrar continued updating birth records for 6 weeks after Czechoslovakia declared independence. He later admitted that he wasn't sure who to send the files to, so it seemed best to just continue. The final census, one of the most symbolic and pointless efforts, came in 1916, a final, empire-wide population census. Yes, the empire was collapsing, borders were uncertain, millions of people were displaced. But the Interior Ministry, in what must have seemed like a noble act of defiance against entropy, ordered it anyway. Officials across the empire distributed census forms in 12 languages, many printed hastily and riddled with errors. The questions included: language spoken at home, primary profession, land ownership status, religious affiliation, ethnicity, loyalty to the emperor. Some towns filled them out in earnest, others ignored them. Still others faked entire returns just to make the numbers look good. In Transylvania, one prefect filed returns for villages that had been evacuated due to Russian attacks. When questioned, he said that the estimates seemed appropriate for pre-conflict demographics. And yet, these returns were bound in neat volumes, catalogued and stored. Where? In the Imperial Archives of Moravia, which would cease to exist 2 years later. Stamps without empires. By late 1918, the imperial system of governance was breaking down rapidly. The post was one of the first things to go. Postal workers, unsure of which authority now ruled their town, often continued delivering mail from whichever ministry had last issued their paycheck. In Galicia, locals began receiving letters from Vienna with notes scribbled on them in Czech or Ukrainian. Do not return. Empire gone. New nations were being declared faster than stamps could be designed. In some bad, order towns, a single envelope might bear 3 different regional seals: Hungarian, Austrian, and one from a self-declared Ukrainian council, each attempting to prove legitimacy through ink. But perhaps the most telling image from this period comes from Ljubljana in Slovenia. A young postmaster, realizing the empire had likely fallen but still obligated to dispatch the day's mail, simply handwrote Provisional Empire over the usual KUK stamp and sent the bags onward. The bureaucrats who stayed, what happened to all the clerks? Many of them simply changed letterhead. When Czechoslovakia was formed, it inherited not only Czech territory, but the civil servants who ran it. Town by town, forms were updated, names transliterated, and stamps remade. The administrative machine carried on with only minor disruptions. The same was true in Croatia, in parts of Poland, even in the Carpathians. The Imperial Forestry Bureau of Bohemia became the State Forestry Service of Czechoslovakia, with exactly the same staff, desks, and in some cases, the same forms, simply with the Habsburg eagle scribbled out. Historians would later note that this bureaucratic continuity made transitions smoother, but it also allowed authoritarian regimes in the 1930s to inherit immensely powerful administrative tools already in place. The empire was dead, but its offices lived on. A last imperial note. One of the most poignant documents from the collapse is a letter written by Karl I, the last emperor, in November 1918. It's short, less a decree, more a resignation letter. In it, he renounces participation in the affairs of state, but stops short of abdicating. The letter is translated into several languages, circulated by telegram and by courier, and finally it is filed, very properly, by the court chancellery under Imperial Correspondence Closure Notices. The empire's last act was to catalogue its own demise. A legacy of ink, and so what did the Habsburgs leave behind? Certainly not a powerful economy or a proud national myth. Their empire was not known for its sweeping conquests or revolutionary ideas, but it did leave something more subtle, a template. The Austro-Hungarian administrative state was one of the first to attempt managing a truly multinational, polyglot, multicultural bureaucracy at scale. It built infrastructure to accommodate difference rather than erase it. It built libraries of regulation. It taught generations of clerks to follow rules, even when no one was watching. Its greatest achievement wasn't war. It was continuity. At its best, it made roads drivable, trains timely, census data legible, and court cases fair across 14 distinct nationalities. It didn't always succeed. Often it failed, catastrophically. But its intentions were oddly modern. Systematize everything, no matter how small. In the end, the Habsburg Empire died with fewer revolutions than expected. No grand guillotine, no storming of palaces, just a quiet redistribution of letterhead, as one empire passed gently into memory. And as you drift deeper into sleep, perhaps there's some comfort in that, a reminder that most of history isn't made in thunderclaps, but in forms filed in triplicate, stamps slightly off-center, and the whisper of pen to paper on an ordinary Tuesday.